Press 1 to enter the conference. You are joining the meeting. This meeting is being recorded.
going this way. Let's go this way. Come on. Hey, no, leave it. Leave it. Come on. I know.
Council members, I think Simon is having trouble with his audio still. So give him another minute, and if that doesn't work, we will go ahead and get started.
I apologize. I just got through here. So
Good.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Twice. Okay, we are ready to pick up with agenda item D1, and I believe we'll have Ms. Sarah here to walk us through this presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. There we go. Looks like the presentation is coming up. Okay, so good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the council. I'm Sarah Cleaver, council staff. I'm presenting agenda item D1. It's the review of the Gulf of Alaska sablefish pot fishery. And this document was a team effort with Sam Cunningham, who's also council staff, and several others at Alaska Fisheries Science Center and at Sustainable Fisheries. So thank you to all of those folks who helped pull this together. The materials for this agenda item that are posted on the e-agenda include the action memo, the report, this PowerPoint, and there are, I believe, 9 written public comments. And as this item went to the IFQ committee, the committee report under agenda D4 includes a summary of the committee's discussion on this topic and their recommendations. So, Mr. Chair, it's my intent to walk through the presentation of the report and then, with your permission, continue on into the IFQ committee's report on this agenda item.
Sounds like a plan. Later.
All right, so diving into the review, many people in this process are familiar with the history of pots in the Gulf, but I'll provide a brief summary. There's a section on the history of the action with more detail starting on page 9 of the document. but sablefish pots were banned in the Gulf of Alaska in 1985, largely due to grounds preemption issues and gear conflicts at the time. And since 2006, the council had received a lot of testimony and written comments concerned with whale depredation in the hook and line fishery. So whales stealing or damaging fish caught on fishing gear. And after several rounds of proposals and discussion papers, Gulf of Alaska Amendment 101 was implemented in 2017, and that allowed Gulf of Alaska Sablefish IFQ to be fished with pot longline gear in response to this increased whale depredation in the hook and line fishery. And so the council's motion on Amendment 101 included a statement that a review on the effects of allowing sablefish pot longline gear in the Gulf of Alaska be conducted 3 years after implementation. Because we had delays due to COVID-19, some sections of this review have now benefited from the inclusion of a fourth year of fishery data, since we're doing this in 2021 instead of 2020. And most of the information that we have in this review is through 2020. However, some of the information, such as revenue, is currently only available through 2019. But one of the benefits of this additional year of data, is that the inclusion of 2020 data provided evidence of this significant shift in the fishery from hook and line gear to pot gear use that we hadn't really seen as well with the 2017 to 2019 data. So we'll be kind of showing that pattern in a couple different ways here. The motion from Amendment 101 is included on page 10 of the document, and I won't read through the whole thing, but the amendment included provisions on pot limits in each area and gear retrieval requirements, as well as specifications on gear marking and a requirement to retain halibut that were caught incidentally in sablefish pots, provided that the sablefish IFQ holder also holds sufficient halibut IFQ. The motion also required that all vessels using pot longline gear had to use logbooks and VMS, and it required the prior notice of landing for a pot longline vessel to declare the number of pots that were fished, the number that were lost, and pots that were still fishing. So moving into some of the data for vessel participation over the past 4 years, the number of pot vessels harvesting sablefish IFQ has increased each year from 22 vessels in 2017 to 104 vessels using pots in 2020. So we saw this really big jump in 2020. And the figure on the right here breaks down the number of vessels by distribution of vessel size. So each section down here is 10 feet. And so these are vessels used to harvest sablefish IFQ in the hook and line fishery in blue. And so those data include 2014 to 2020. We just wanted to include a few years prior to the implementation of the pot fishery. And the pot fishery are those data in orange from 2017 to 2020. And so from 2014 to 2016, vessels that were smaller than 40 feet constituted about 7% of all vessels in the Gulf of Alaska sablefish IFQ fishery. And in comparison, there weren't any vessels under 40 using pots until 2020, when I believe there were 2 vessels that started using pot gear that were under 40. So the largest proportion of sablefish IFQ vessels still falls within this 50 to 60 foot range, both in terms of pots and hook and line vessels. The development of new pot designs, which we'll get into detail on later in the presentation, but the development of new pot designs that are lighter and more easily stackable on smaller decks have likely contributed to this increase in pot gear use on some of the smaller vessels that we're starting to see, particularly in 2020. But we'll get into more of that discussion on the new pot designs in a little bit. As far as processing participation, the majority of processors accepting Gulf of Alaska Sablefish IFQ pot deliveries are in the Central Gulf, specifically Kodiak and Seward. So the second column here in this table, this table ranks the ports of landing by the percentage of all Gulf of Alaska Sablefish caught in pots that were landed at each port, and this is just for 2020. So the values in this second column, while a lot of these data are confidential, they sum to 100%. So Kodiak represents 30% of all Sablefish IFC pot gear deliveries in the Gulf, and Seward is 21%. In turn, the third column here, this is the percent of pot caught sablefish at each port level. So, for example, in Kodiak, 76% of all sablefish that were landed there, 76% of all sablefish were caught with pots that were landed in Kodiak. And so Seward similarly at 60%. As far as the effort in this fishery, so this table on the left here, this breaks down the number of IFQ trips for each gear type. So by vessels fishing Sablefish IFQ, or vessels fishing Sablefish IFQ using hook and line gear or pots, and you can see the same trend here kind of increasing in 2020. And comparing the effort of vessels using pot gear with vessels using hook and line gear isn't the same type of comparison as using hook to hook or pot to pot, and doesn't really account for the amount of time that fishermen spend on the ground, but it is just one way to, or one measure of effort that we used in this review. So the total number of IFQ trips has generally stayed the same across years, but the number of trips using pot gear has generally been increasing as a proportion of the total number of trips. Shown on the right, the number of trips on vessels that use a combination of hook and line and pot gear, this is known as a mixed gear trip. This appears to be increasing. Fishery participants may choose a mixed gear trip for sablefish, or might decide to fish sablefish with pots and then fish halibut if they have IFQ using their hook and line gear. When we've had discussions with some of the fishermen involved in this fishery, they've said that fishing multiple gears can increase efficiency by soaking sablefish pots while fishing hook and line gear for halibut, but we've also heard that some fishermen are fishing multiple gears because they are limited by the number of pots that they can have on board due to the pot limits, and so they're fishing hook and line gear while their pots are soaking. And in kind of our public testimony, and while we were at the IFQ committee, we heard a variety of perspectives on that we can go into later during the report, or during the committee report. It looks like this slide, table on the left came up a little funky, but hopefully you can still see it all right. So the vessels that fish sablefish pots must adhere to the pot limits that I mentioned before, and they're specific to each sub-area. So pot limits are 120 pots per vessel in West Yakutat and Southeast outside waters, and 300 pots in the Western Gulf and Central Gulf. And so according to this table, the average number of pots per vessel on most observed trips are well below the pot limits in each area, with vessels using fewer than the allowable number of pots. But I will note, and this is really important, that the sample size of these data, these are observer data, and the sample size is small. And so some fishery participants have indicated that they are setting a full limit of pots. And I wanted to note that the public comment that we've heard is different from these data. So there are some significant caveats here. And to kind of back that up, that these data should be caveated in the table on the right here. This indicates that some vessels are using far below their limit of pots on some trips. Others might be reaching or even exceeding their pot limits. So there is a wide variety here, and these data should be taken with a grain of salt. And we get into further monitoring and observer data a little bit later in the presentation. Starting on page 27 in the document, there are a few figures that attempt to illustrate the spatial distribution of the sablefish catch, both in the pot and hook and line fisheries. And these data are from the Catch in Areas database. So this allocates catch based on a blend of processor data, fish tickets, and observer data when it's available, as well as VMS data. And so there are several caveats to these data as well, which are highlighted on page 26. But our intent with these figures was to show a rough illustration of the fishery footprint. And so if you compare figure 3.3 and figure 3.4, let me make sure that I've got those figure numbers correct here. Comparing figure 3.3 and it's actually figure 3.5. The hook and line and pot harvest appear to have similar fishery footprints, but the pot harvest is more narrowly focused on the shelf edge than in the hook and line fishery, which is a bit more spread out. However, there's this higher concentration of hook and line catch in Western Yakutat and Southeast, while the pot harvest is definitely more prevalent in the Central Gulf and Western Gulf. Looks like there's a question.
Yes, Mr. Weaver, thank you. Mr. Downs.
Yes, thank you. I just gone back on your previous slide. I tried to get my hand up before you moved on to that previous slide. I just see on the maximum number of pots in 2020, the number 427. Is that the number of observed that number's above the pot limit? So I'm wondering how you could ever get to 427. I guess that's my question.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Mr. Noun, for the question. So these are observer data, so it just indicates a time when the vessel did use more than the max number of pots there. And I can't speak to whether or not that was in violation, but that 427 number of pots certainly is above any of the pot limits.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That answers my question.
Right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let's see, I think we're moving on to, So for more on the Sablefish Harvest, figure 3.1 on the left here and table 3.1 in the document illustrate how the amount of sablefish harvested by gear type has obviously changed over the past few years with this introduction of sablefish pots particularly in 2020. And in 2017 and 2018, these first couple of years after implementation of the pot fishery, pot fishing made up a really small proportion of the fixed gear catch. It was about 10 to 12% in these first couple of years. And then the proportion of pots, of fixed gear catch in pots in the Gulf increased to 21% in 2019 and then up to 48% in 2020. And this overall catch in terms of weight, the overall IFQ catch in pots in the Gulf increased each year from roughly 900 tons in 2017 to roughly 4,500 tons in 2020, while the hook and line catch decreased from about 7,600 tons to approximately 5,000 tons in 2020. On the right here, breaking harvest down by area. Actually, excuse me, not in this figure, but in the document we've included in Table 3.2 shows that if you break the harvest down by area, over half of the Gulf of Alaska sablefish pot occurs in the Central Gulf. And then here on the slide, we show the percent of sablefish IFQ landings caught by pots in each sub area. So for example, in the Western Gulf in 2020, 85% of the sablefish IFQ was landed in pots, and Southeast has kind of made up a much smaller proportion of that. So in 2020, about 16% of sablefish IFQ was landed in pots in the Southeast. We wanted to provide some information on incidental catch in sablefish pots, and this figure shows the incidental catch in sablefish pot fishery compared to the hook and line fishery. So each figure on the right of each year is hook and line, and on the left is, on the left is hook and line, and on the right is pot gear. And as illustrated in this figure, the incidental catch in the sablefish pot fishery is minimal across years. It's actually, so if we look to 2020, 96% of the catch is sablefish, and only 4% of the catch are these other species. And that's pretty consistent across years in pot gear. So the incidental catch across the first 3 years were largely comprised of Pacific halibut, which is shown in purple, but substantially less than what we see in hook and line gear. And I'll note that the Pacific halibut are allowed to be commercially retained if the vessel has the necessary IFQ on board. There's also a little bit of grenadier catch in black. And in 2020, there was a little bit more catch of arrowtooth flounder, which is in the orange here. And so if we take this 4%, this small amount of incidental catch, and we expand that out so we can see a little bit better what is making up that 4%, that's shown in this figure. And we noted in discussions with fishery participants that they provided us some information on the different tunnel designs and openings of their pots that might affect the bycatch distribution, but we don't have much information on why certain bycatch may be occurring or whether the trends in bycatch can be attributed to the development of better gear or more experience with the fishery. So when we brought this to the IFQ committee, we wanted to seek some input from fishery participants on, why different types of bycatch may be occurring or changing. Looking a little bit deeper into halibut catch, as part of Amendment 101, the legal size halibut, so over 32 inch, are required to be retained if sufficient halibut IFQ is on board, as I said before. And so some of the halibut...
Apologies, Ms. Leader. I'm going to remind members of the public, please mute your phone. Okay, all right. Ms. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So some of the halibut that's caught in pots is retained rather than discarded as prohibited species catch. And the council didn't identify management measures to limit halibut IFQ retention to incidental amounts as part of Amendment 101, but groundfish pots in the Gulf are currently required to have a tunnel opening that is no wider than 9 inches. And that was thought to limit the halibut or kind of limit the size of halibut that you might get in pots. And so table 4.4 on the slide here indicates that pot gear has consistently caught a smaller percentage of halibut, from roughly 1 to 3% of the catch, than hook and line gear, which is roughly 7 to 9% of the catch. And while this, looking at table 4.5 on the bottom here, this shows the percent of halibut that was retained versus discarded in the sablefish pot fishery. And so we've seen this vary a little bit annually, and overall retention has dropped a little bit. But as compared to the halibut caught in IFQ fishery, so these numbers, as you compare them to the hook and line fishery, retains roughly 60 to 70%. So that's the sablefish hook and line fishery retains roughly 60 to 70%. So you can kind of make a rough comparison of these numbers if you want to compare those two gear types. And one of the things that we heard through fishery participants, I believe it was at the IFQ committee, was just that it's possible that this number, the percent retained of halibut, that's decreasing, possibly because of the changes in gear are catching more smaller halibut. And so if they're not legal size, obviously they have to be discarded. And so that might be one reason that we're seeing this change in the retention rate, but we aren't totally sure. We provided some information on fishery revenues. So table 5.2 on the top here shows the total ex-vessel revenue, which has declined overall, but due to an increase in the catch volume in pot, the pot ex-vessel value did increase in 2019. And as I said previously, these values aren't available for 2020 data yet, so we can only go through 2019 with most of these revenue data. The table on the bottom here shows that the ex-vessel price per pound of sablefish IFQ declined from 2017 to 2019. And this tracks with the broad trend in the value of the fishery due to fish size, as well as changes in foreign market demand. These data show kind of just another way of showing the ex-vessel price by year is declining, but broken out by each sub area. And so you can see the year trends from 2014 to 2019 across hook and line and pot gear. And this is on page 36 of the document. A little bit more on fishery revenue. So these are 2020, these data go through 2020, and this is actually data that are used in the small sablefish release analysis. So these are data from in-season fish tickets that were put together in December of 2020. And so the data isn't fully reconciled here through 2020, but it's the data that was available at that time. So on the left-hand side, you can see by market category, the percent of fish caught with pot gear are starting to creep up as a proportion more into the larger size into the larger size category. So in 2019 and 2020, the pot gear category showed an increase in the proportion of fish landed at larger market sizes. And so those are those fish 3 pounds and higher, while the size distribution of the hook and line gear catch remained fairly consistent with previous years. And so this kind of ties back into how this fishery is still new and people are still learning with this gear type. We've heard a variety of different ways that people are deploying their gear or tuning their gear. For example, we've heard some people are using escape rings, and we have some Oxbay lab data that we'll show here coming up on the size selectivity by gear type. That kind of speaks to this a little bit as well. I will note that the most notable trend, and this is on page 38, there's a notable trend that even without the complete fish ticket data, we see that ex-vessel prices per pound for 2020, which are only preliminary data. These indicate that the pot gear harvest values on a per pound basis are beginning to surpass the prices for hook and line gear at the market category level. And it's table 5-6 on page 38 that shows that information. So it's an interesting thing to point out. As far as monitoring in the pot fishery, so in 2020, obviously they're reporting lower observer deployment percentages due to the emergency waivers that applied for vessels from March until July, except for the vessels that departed out of Pottags. And we can see here on the slide, there's again this recent expansion of pot gear use into new vessel categories and into the smaller vessel categories. We have on page 44 and 45 of the document, we include these violin plots that summarize the number of trips by vessel category and size. And so those show that looking across years, the adoption of pot gear is expanding into those smaller vessel sizes in 2020. And we believe that this is attributable to the development of slinky pots, which we'll likely hear about in public testimony more, but we also discussed, it was discussed quite a bit at the ISQ committee as well. And so these slinky pots are allowing a lot of smaller vessels to be able to participate in this fishery in ways that they previously hadn't been able to due to size on deck and stability concerns. Continuing with monitoring, so pot gear has created some challenges for electronic monitoring reviewers. The Fisheries Monitoring and Analysis Division at Alaska Fisheries Science Center has told us that when EM was introduced for hook and line gear, they had a side-by-side analysis or review of EM versus observer protocols, but that hasn't been done yet for pots. And so that's kind of just one of the challenges that we've heard from FMA. And if vessels want to use both gear types, they need a vessel monitoring plan for each gear type. And so there are just some challenges with EM gathering that data and protocols that the fishermen have to learn in order to do that. This table shows the number of trips by observer and EM category, and this doesn't tell you how many. So this column will tell you how many trips were observed and the vessel size, but overall, this shows you kind of the would-be universe that the selection percent is applied to. So we have the number of trips and the trips that were actually observed. And you can see that particularly in 2020, we had some pretty low rates, which kind of ties back to some of the caveats of the data that we were able to use in this analysis. Moving on to the stock assessment considerations. So depredation of sablefish off of hook and line gear by killer whales and sperm whales has presented an emerging challenge for stock assessment authors in recent years. And we include a description of how depredation is accounted for starting on page 46 of the document. And that information is always provided to the council through the SAFE documents at the October and December meetings. And the stock assessment authors do a much better job of describing that information. So I'll really focus on the high points. There appears to be kind of this general decline in sperm whale depredation in most areas of the Gulf of Alaska since 2017. And that's predominantly true in the Central Gulf. So while the stock assessment authors haven't yet fully investigated this, it could be partially due to more of the catch being taken with pot gear. That's something that they're still exploring. And we talked to the authors a little bit about catch per unit effort estimation, and CPUE is denominated in pounds per hook for the hook and line fishery and pounds per pot for pot fishing, but these metrics aren't equivalent, and so currently they're not standardized into one index. And at this time, pot CPUE isn't included in the Sablefish Fishery CPUE index. I know this has kind of been brought up before at some of the previous council meetings, but to provide kind of an update, the stock assessment authors are continuing to explore development of a catch rate index that can combine hook and line and pot gear as they continue to get additional years and provide, as they get a longer time series of data to use. So while these pot CPUE data aren't, they're not included in the stock assessment model, they're still reported in the assessment. And presently, the two gear types are combined for assessment purposes. And that's largely because of this limited data or limited time series of data to allow the independent estimation of pot selectivity. And this recent increase in pot effort in the Gulf, as well as the introduction of these new gear types such as slinky pots, will likely influence the size selectivity of pot gear overall. So these are kind of preliminary data, and we expect things to continue changing as gear and gear designs in the fishery continue to change. But at present, the escape rings that are designed to let small fish exit the pot are not required by regulation, but they are used in a portion of the fleet. And so this goes back to what we were showing earlier in the revenue section. But according to those that we've talked to that are involved in the fishery, sorting for larger fish in sablefish pots is an ongoing process to find the most successful combination of escape ring size as well as soak time. So the soak time can be adjusted while balancing impacts on product quality and the need to tend gear due to the gear retrieval requirements. And so as practices in gear in the sablefish pot fishery continue to be refined, we might see this continue to change. And the stock assessment authors generously provided these length frequencies that were recorded by observers in the sablefish pot and hook and line fisheries. And so these differences in size selectivity are shown on page 50 and 51. And it appears that fish caught in pots may be slightly smaller than those caught in hook and line gear, but these data also have caveats, and one of those is that no length or age data are gathered through electronic monitoring. So trying to get an adequate sample size from observer data is necessary in order to try to get proper representation of the size distribution of the catch. Obviously, there have been few samples, particularly in 2020. And another kind of caveat of these data is that there are differences in sablefish length that can be attributed in part to fishing in different areas. And so on the right here, we do have them broken out by sub-area. And you can see that the sizes in each sub-area between the two gear types are much closer. But even within those sub-areas, there are likely size differences in particular areas of the Gulf. And so as we showed in the spatial distribution slide, over the 2017 through 2020 period, pot gear harvest was relatively concentrated in a few specific areas in the Gulf, and hook and line effort was generally more spread out. So that may have some implications for these data as well. The last thing that we wanted to highlight about these size selectivity data is that the effect of the large recruitment events and the influx of small fish into the population of certain age classes is what we're seeing now. That further complicates interpreting estimates of size selectivity, particularly without a greater number of samples. So as we continue to get more data, the assessment authors will be able to tease out these data a little bit more. Kind of heading into a new section of our review, we had a lot of discussions with fishery participants that reflected how experimentation with pot longline gear is still occurring, and the gear configurations and fishing strategies will continue to vary as people kind of figure out the most efficient method in this fishery. And available information on the cost of pot gear and vessel conversion, we gathered some of that from folks that we spoke to, but it's anecdotal information, and it covers a wide range depending on the present state of a vessel and the type of pot longline setup that each vessel plans to deploy. So cost information, as well as some of the other types of information we wanted to include here, is difficult to collect systematically, even when it's volunteered to us, because adaptations to pot gear are often part of a broader vessel upgrade or refit. And so over the first few years of the Sablefish pot fishery, there have been a bunch of different types of pots and sizes of pots and styles that have emerged through industry innovation. We've seen some pots that are rectangular, others that are conical, and then the slinky or collapsible pot. And figure 8.1 in the document illustrates a few of the different types of pots, as well as on here on the slide. And despite the variations in all of these designs, there are a couple specific requirements that all pots in the sablefish fishery have to adhere to. And so regulations specified that pots used in a pot longline set for sablefish must comply with a biodegradable panel and a 9-inch tunnel opening mentioned previously. And so the page 55, I know this came up, there was a question about this in the AP report, so I'll just highlight this right now, but page 55 has a description of the biodegradable panel and some of what we've heard in public comment about slinky pots and the latch mechanism that they currently use in place of a biodegradable panel. And so page 55 tries to clarify some of that, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that in public comment, and it was discussed thoroughly at the IFQ committee as well. One of the other requirements is for pot tags and pot limits. And to participate in this fishery, a vessel owner has to apply to NPFMC annually and register their vessel in order to participate and request new pot tags for a specified vessel in a specific district or regulatory area. So all the pot longline gear that's registered to a vessel has to have a registered tag attached to the pot before leaving port, and the tag may only be removed from the pot after the pot is returned to shore. And so the original intent of these pot tags was to enforce pot limits and to be able to track lost gear. And each of these tags, as you can see on the slide here, has a unique serial number, and the pot tag is unique to, or the pot tag color, is unique to the IFQ regulatory area. And so Section 9.1 of the document reflects discussions that we had with NPFMC and OLE and the U.S. Coast Guard about the administrative burden and the cost of pot tags. NPFMC, OLE, and the Coast Guard have assessed that this gear marking requirement is not useful for the at-sea enforcement of pot limits. And NPFMC recommends that the council consider whether pot tags continue to be, a necessary provision of this program, as they are costly to implement. According to enforcement and the Coast Guard representative, this marking requirement hasn't really been useful for enforcing pot limits. And NPFMC also suggests changes to regulations to combine the IFQ Sablefish pot longline gear vessel registration, which is one form, and the request for pot gear tags application form. So there's these two separate forms, and if we continue going down this route of using pot tags, NPFMC recommends combining those two forms into one. We had a lot of discussion, or I guess the committee had a lot of discussion about pot tags at the IFQ committee. So I'll be kind of touching on that a little bit more in the IFQ committee report, rather than trying to kind of go through our presentation and discuss the committee report at the same time. I'll try to keep these two things separate. The next part, in terms of enforcement, so this starts on page 60 and refers to the automatic identification system. When the council originally considered Amendment 101, the council was focused on gear conflict and grounds preemption and how people would know where gear was on the grounds. And AIS was one of a variety of technological solutions that people thought could work well in this fishery. But under FCC regulations, the use of AIS on fishing gear isn't currently authorized. And that was the case when the council was considering Amendment 101. But the council did decide to include putting flagpoles with radar reflectors on buoys marking both ends of each taut string. But this AIS question was kind of left hanging out there since it wasn't authorized. And so representatives of the fishery have engaged at the congressional level, and we wanted to provide an update on kind of where that stands now. Through the most recent National Defense Authorization Act, that triggered the FCC to consider, and consider being the operative word there, it forced them to consider authorizing AIS for use with fishing gear. and they need to initiate that process this summer, 180 days from when the act passed last December. And so that's kind of where it stands right now. And we may hear a lot on other options or ways to mark gear and kind of how to help vessels have visibility of gear on the ground that might not involve AIS since it's not authorized yet. But we wanted to just provide a little bit of a report back on AIS because it's my understanding that this was much discussed a lot back when the council was taking action on Amendment 101. And when the council developed Amendment 101, they approached the fishery from a stance of trying to balance the whale depredation issue or solving the whale depredation issue and developing this new fishery with trying to protect the existing hook and line fleet. And so we attempted to include information where possible on some of these other elements and issues that were part of the action alternative of Amendment 101, such as the pot limits, gear retrieval, and gear specifications. And what came out of that was that we included a non-exclusive list of topics in this category in Section 10 of the document. And these are topics or questions that we encountered while speaking with fishery participants, managers, and the stock assessment scientists. And in many instances, questions arose that weren't able to be objectively answered, either due to kind of how the fishery is still new and expanding, and fishery participants are still developing certain knowledge, but also because oftentimes these questions point to data that aren't collected systematically or at all. And so when we went to the IFQ committee, we felt that these topics may be best informed through public testimony and stakeholder engagement, as varying perspectives do exist on some of these issues. And so I think the IFQ committee report kind of reflects some of the highlights of information surrounding these issues. And so that'll be likely best described there and through public testimony. So I just wanted to say thanks to everybody who kind of helped put this review together, all the agency, enforcement, stock assessment authors, and particularly the fishery participants who chatted with us on the phone and emailed us, and also thanks to all of them for the pictures of this fishery. And I'll take any questions for now, and then after questions on the report are complete, I guess we could move to the IFQ committee report.
Thank you, Ms. Cleaver. Mr. Marks.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Ms. Cleaver. So in your discussion on the stakeholder input or when you were thinking about tags or markers, is there any information on gear loss with these long-line pots and how that is mitigated if there is? And I asked since I participated on a Recovery Act project to help remove derelict crab gear and was always surprised at the amount of that. But I'm just wondering, do we have any information on that issue regarding these sablefish pots? Thanks.
Through the chair, Mr. Marks. Yes, we do. So I actually have an exact number right in front of me. So this is kind of cumulatively over the first 3 years. So through between 2017 and 2020, there were 1,436 pots for sablefish landings that were reported lost in the Gulf. And we don't have, kind of get to the other part of your question, we don't have information on like exactly where they were lost, but lost gear is tracked in the prior notice of landing and in the logbooks that fishermen fill out. And I know there were concerns, and there still remain concerns about grounds preemption from lost pots, and people being worried that pots that are lost may contribute to kind of this grounds preemption problem, or just gear conflicts with other folks. And there was a lot of conversation on this at the IFQ committee.
Great, thanks.
Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Cleaver, I was going to ask you whether that number you just gave, we did hear a lot of discussion at the IFQ committee from people who said oftentimes when they lost a pot that they didn't know which pot they lost, and so they might ask for kind of a full set of replacement tags. So we heard that several times, and I want to be clear when you say you know how many pots were lost. Do you know how many pots were lost, or do you know how many replacement tags were requested?
Through the chair, Ms. Campbell. So I kind of went down into a rabbit hole with some of the folks at NIMS, and that number that I just provided is specifically for the number of pots. Obviously, the number for replacement tags is much higher and separate from that. And so this is the information that NIMS has specifically on the number of pots that were reported lost.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Cleaver, for that clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Campbell. Any further questions on the D1 presentation? Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Cleaver. I was back on the monitoring section. There were some, statements about the difficulty in monitoring, especially with the advent of EM, and I was wondering if there were any recommendations that came out of the review relative to monitoring, or it's just pointing out the different vessel monitoring plans and then coverage rate based on observers versus EM for both gear types.
Through the chair, Ms. Kimball. So there weren't, in our discussions with SMA, there weren't any specific recommendations, but it was just meant to highlight some of the challenges with EM. And yeah, that's all the information that I have on that. I'd have to follow up with SMA if they have any specific recommendations, but they didn't know any at this time.
Okay, that's what I was looking for. Thank you.
Any further questions before we move to the ISQ report, the committee report? Don't see any. So just real quick, for members of the public who are wishing to sign up to testify on agenda item D1, please do so prior to the conclusion of the committee report.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I am putting on a different hat now and presenting the IFQ committee report for D1. And because this is the first time we're discussing the report here at the council, I'll just provide a little summary and set us up for the following actions here. So the IFQ committee met on March 25th and 26th. And under agenda item D4, they have the action memo, the whole committee report, which I'll be referring to, as well as the committee's e-agenda. And so the first day of the committee, there were presentations and discussions on this item, Sablefish pots, as well as the IFQ access opportunities, a couple proposals and several other non-action items. And then the second day was really focused on prioritization of IFQ-related items. And there was a poll created by council staff that was used to canvass members on their relative priority of items, as well as their thoughts on how complex each item would be, or any potential controversy that would make moving action forward there more difficult. And so after that poll was conducted, members provided context to their votes through the continuing discussion. And I'll just be going through the part of the report that's relevant to Sablefish pots. So these are the results of the Google poll that occurred to aid discussion around prioritization. And so this includes all the committee member responses, and the relative priority is included. This is included in an appendix to the IFQ committee report. And so the blue category means that committee members felt that a certain item, so each of the items the IFQ committee took up are here on the left, and blue meant that they felt it was useful and non-controversial, and let's get it done. So that was kind of the potentially speediest and most urgent or easiest agenda item or priorities. And orange was high priority, but these were items that committee members felt were likely to have some complexity or controversy. And then yellow was, these were items that committee members wanted to keep on the list, but may be a little bit lower priority or maybe have some complexity. And then the gray that represented things that the committee member may have felt was not worth moving forward at this point. And so there's a little bit more discussion in the report on kind of why the committee may have felt, if they felt that there was an item that was high priority but might have a lot of complexity, and which color they rated that as. So as far as the committee report for Sablefish pot, we provided a shortened version of this report to the IFQ committee, and the committee heard comments both for and against changes to different parts of this program, such as the gear retrieval requirements, the gear marking requirements, and changes to or removal of the pot limits. Some of the participants who fish primarily in Southeast or Western Yakutat felt that area was a little bit different and should be treated a little bit differently due to an increased potential for gear conflicts on that narrower area of the shelf. There were several testifiers in the committee that noted that some of the concerns that they had during the development of Amendment 101 were not completely realized to the extent they had anticipated based on these first 3 years in the fishery. So some of the concerns that small boats may not be able to participate in this fishery, for example, and there would be more issues with small vessels on the ground and gear conflicts, that it partially changed with the introduction of slinky pots. So we heard a little bit about that at the committee meeting. But on the other side of that, some participants noted that, as there was this desire for any changes to loosen regulations, such as the pot limit, some participants wanted those changes to be made incrementally and for the council to proceed with caution in order to continue mitigating the likelihood of gear conflicts and grounds preemption issues. So there were, as far as pot limits, the committee received a few different proposals. So currently we have the 120 pot limit for Southeast and Western Yakutat and 300 in Western and Central Gulf. And a couple of the proposals recommended uniform pot limits across the Gulf. Another proposal requested reconsidering the 120 pot limit, but but didn't specify an alternative limit, just stating that that pot limit was too low. And so committee members that were in support of changing the pot limit suggested that an increase in this limit could increase efficiency and flexibility within the fishery. There were a few testifiers and a committee member that noted that they wouldn't necessarily be fishing as many pots as the limit would allow, but that an increase in the pot limit would actually help them be able to carry spare gear that could allow them to continue a trip in case something happens to their gear. And it was noted that lower pot limits sometimes, particularly the low pot limits in Southeast and Western Yakutat, sometimes resulted in vessels setting pots and then fishing with hook and line gear, as was noted earlier in the report. And some participants think that that is less efficient, particularly in the context of whales, but it's something that they can do while they let their pots soak. Let's see, there was some discussion about whether there is any need for pot limits in a rationalized fishery, but unless the council recommends the total removal of pot limits, most testifiers and committee members agreed that the pot limit or the pot limit of 300 pots for the Central Gulf and Western Gulf was appropriate for those areas at this time. And the modifications to pot limits, looking in the survey or the prioritization survey, members felt that the modifications to pot limits would be worth exploring. There was a little bit of diversity in the level of priority. So this would be this item right here, kind of varying perspectives across committee members. And so half of the committee members indicated the modifications to pot limits as a lower priority. As far as the gear tending requirements or the pot retrieval requirements, currently gear can't be left for more than 5 days in the Central Gulf or Western Yakutat without being moved. That limit is 7 days in the Western Gulf. And in Southeast, gear cannot be left on the ground for any length of time when the vessel goes in to make a delivery. And so there was a lot of discussion about this. There was one proposal that suggested increasing the gear tending length to 7 days in Southeast and Western Yakutat, and another that suggested raising the limit to be uniform across the Gulf to 7 days. There was another that suggested a 9-day requirement. And so the proposers suggested that the gear tending requirements as they are currently create a safety concern, as harvesters have to retrieve their gear even during bad weather or if something happens to their vessel. And so there was concern expressed that that enforcement would be citing fishermen for violating those gear tending requirements in cases of extreme weather or mechanical failure. And so the committee requested that enforcement be able to use some reasonable discretion there. And the committee agreed that revisions to the gear retrieval regulations could be explored to possibly extend the number of days for gear to be left on the ground. There were a couple schools of thought on maintaining the gear retrieval requirements, particularly in Southeast. And so some committee members noted that if you are able to kind of get in and get out after catching their quota with pots, that would actually open the grounds up more quickly, and felt that the combination of pot limits and gear tending requirements slowed down the fishery and actually kind of more congested the ground. But we also heard that others felt that given that narrow shelf in Southeast, it's important to allow for a rotation of effort from different vessels in order to mitigate the ground preemption issues. So there were certainly members that were concerned about potential for gear competition and gear conflict. And the committee noted that this is really intertwined with the AIS issue. The key challenge is really the ability to contact the vessel whose gear is on the ground over the radio. And so this is kind of associated with the committee's eagerness for AIS technology to be authorized for fishing gear. I'll note that the committee recommended that the council send a letter to the FCC in favor of allowing AIS to be used to identify gear locations. And then most committee members felt that this issue of gear retrieval is worth exploring, but there was kind of a divergence on the level of priority to assign to it. The committee discussed the difficulties with Pottags and whether this was kind of in relation as well to whether the pot limits are efficient from an operational standpoint. So the committee recommended that the requirement for pot tags be removed to address an unnecessary burden and cost. And the majority of members, if we look back to this slide, the majority of members felt that this was a non-controversial action that would be considered a high priority. A few people noted that there have been situations where if a pot or a pot tag is lost and a fisherman needs to order another one from NIMP, it's not practical to know exactly which tag number, so like which serial number was on the lost pot without doing a total restacking of the pots. And a few people have figured out ways to keep track of this, but oftentimes fishermen would order an entire new set of pot tags when only a few were lost. And so this really increased program costs and some administrative burden. And the committee members and stakeholders observed that tags aren't used in other pot fisheries, and that the preferable approach, the committee felt the preferable approach would be to remove this requirement altogether. There was a question about kind of how this could be expedited, and we had some NIMP suggestions that because pot tags are a record-keeping and reporting requirement, they could potentially be, the issue of pot tags could be kind of taken alone as a regulatory amendment. And that being said, there were some committee members that highlighted the value in being able to continue tracking the number of lost pots, and other members stated that logbooks might be an alternative approach to be able to track lost gear. That brings us to the pot configuration requirements. So the committee heard testimony on the continuing development and innovation in pot designs and some of the challenges of the current gear specification requirements. One was particularly the biodegradable panel. One testifier stated that there's a biodegradable latch that's currently used on slinky pots that holds the door closed until it degrades. And as they're currently designed, this wouldn't be legal under OLE's interpretation of a biodegradable panel. Additionally, the committee, just pulling through my notes here. The committee, as far as the 9-inch tunnel requirement, the committee wasn't opposed to allowing the retention of halibut taken with pots, and thus potentially modifying this requirement. But they did note that they didn't want to tie these two gear design requirements, the biodegradable panel and the 9-inch tunnel issue together if it slowed down the biodegradable panel issue, and trying to solve that to ensure slinky pots are able to meet the legal gear specifications. As far as the gear end marking requirements, committee members kind of had mixed views on whether to continue requiring both ends to be marked. It's helpful in order to avoid gear conflicts, but these are, some of the committee members noted that some of these pot sets, these gear sets are relatively short, and marking one end might be sufficient. And that carrying some of this additional buoy line, and as well as all the other gear that must be stowed on deck, can be burdensome to some of the smaller vessels. I believe those are all of the kind of highlights from the IFQ committee report, and I certainly invite Ms. Campbell to expand on anything if I've missed it. Hopefully I've captured everything appropriately in here.
Thank you, Ms. Cleaver. Ms. Campbell, would you like to expand on anything?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that Ms. Cleaver did an excellent job of summarizing the committee's discussion, and I'll have more overall comments when we get to our full committee report. But for now, I have nothing to add.
All right, great. Thank you. Okay. Any questions from council members on the IF committee report? Mr. Mesereau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Cleaver. I guess I just want to get one more time from you in terms of pots. Were you using the tags being reordered as the metric to determine how many pots were lost, or did you have some other way to drill down? And I think that in just the IFQ committee, but in your presentation as well, I just wanted to get some clarity on that. I didn't quite get it.
Through the chair, Mr. Mesereau. So the data on the lost pots did not come from the number of tags. That came from a few different conversations with NIMS staff, and I believe came from the reporting that happens when a vessel does its prior notice of landing, and there are technicians that gather that information from the vessel operators. And so the ordering of the pot tags in the IFQ committee, we provided, NIMS provided us with a bunch of information specifically on replacing pot tags, and there were many, many more pot tags than that had to be replaced over the past few years. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you, Ms. Cleaver. Bring us to public testimony. Sure. Looks like we have 7 members of the public signed up to testify. That will be Paul Clampett, then Bob Elverson, and then Alexander Stubbs.
Thank you, Chairman Keenan. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Paul Clampett, president of the Sablefish and Halibut Pot Association and owner of the fishing vessel Augustine. I want to point out some highlights from the pot review that was prepared by staff. I think that this report was very well done, considering the restraints imposed on staff caused by the pandemic. Number one, pots took 48% of the fixed gear sablefish in 2020, increasing from 21% in 2019. We expect to see another exponential jump in pot use for 2021. Incidental bycatch is practically non-existent. If you include halibut as part of the targeted catch and use grenadiers as bait, pot gear retains 98% of its catch. In 2020, halibut as a percentage of catch in pots was 1%, and with hook and line, it's 9%. Pot gear solves the whale deprecation problem. The gear is an overwhelming success. It has proven to have very low bycatch without whale deprecation. We need onerous pot regulations relaxed, including the ability to leave gear out while delivering in Southeast Alaska. We ask for uniform pot regulations across the Gulf, 7-day retrieval times, and the ability to carry 300 pots. Relaxing these regulations will make pot fishing more efficient, allowing us to leave the grounds quickly and thus free up the grounds for other participants. The concern over grounds preemption by pots, in our opinion, is misplaced. Pots are no different than hook and line when it comes to ground preemption. Hook and line preempts the ground just the same as pots. You do not want to be set down by hook and line gear any more than you do by pots. Communication by fishermen is the key to sharing the grounds, and we haven't found it to be any more of an issue than it was before pots were allowed. There is no requirement for hook and line gear to remove their gear while delivering, and hook and line gear is left on the grounds on occasions. As far as pot tags go, we see no need for these. We have to log lost gear the same way as hook and line does, and we think that logging of the gear is sufficient. We need the pot configuration rules lifted so we can develop this gear further. We have noticed more deprecation by whales in the halibut fishery, so we need to develop pots that efficiently capture halibut. We also need to be able to discard small sablefish which we have shown through in Kanucky's report that it is an overall benefit to the fishery. The Sablefish and Halibut Pot Association encourages the council to help this fishery and give it the tools to continue to expand to be efficient. And I thank you for the opportunity to testify. And I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Clampett. Any questions? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, next up is Bob Elverson.
Yes, Chairman, can you coming through?
Loud and clear.
Okay. So for the record, my name is Bob Alverson. I'm representing Fishing Vessel Owners Association, and would like to also emphasize that what Paul just testified to, that 48%, I think, of the sablefish was taken by pot gear last year. We would think that somewhere between 75 to 80%, maybe not by vessels, but by tonnage, will be taken by pots this year. So another huge increase, and it's proving to be a very efficient type of gear to keep away from the predation from these killer whales and sperm whales. So there are 5 items under D1 that we would like to highlight, that we would like to see in an omnibus package. Number 1 is the element of tendering the requirement either to be removed or to have additional days added. And we would support what the IFQ committee, I think, suggested, or one of the suggestions was 7 days for elimination of that requirement. 2, eliminating the current configuration requirements as suggested by the advisory panel. This deals mostly with the 9-inch opening requirement in the regs, but there's also the requirement to have cotton biodegradable panel. With the round slinky pots, Office of Law Enforcement is not recognizing the cylinder of the pot as a panel. The panel to them is like the side of a crab or a Pacific cod pot, which is square or rectangle and flat, I guess. So FEOA would like the ability to have at the end of the cylinder that opens up to release, to dump the fish out, to have that end be twined with cotton, so that if it's lost, then it biodegrades and that end opens up. 3, we'd like to see, we support the options that the IFQ committee recommended on pot limits. Specifically to Southeast, I think they ranged from 120 to X, I think. And I'd just like to say that the current 120 pot limit in Southeast keeps a crew of 4 to 5 busy about 2/3 of the day, and then they're not doing anything for 1/3 of the day. So 170 pots, we think, would keep the crew in the boat busy for on a continuous basis. So just for what that's worth, we think there should be a small increase in the pot limit in Southeast. With regards to the tags, we support the NIMP's request and recommendation to have that removed, and also the IFQ committee's endorsement of that, and then the AP as well endorsed that, I believe. And then last of all, there's a requirement for the number of bags on the boat, or bags at the end of the gear, and we would support the elimination of some of those bags as recommended in the IFQ committee report. Mr. Chairman, that concludes our comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Albertson. Dirk Twite has a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. Albertson. I actually was thinking I would ask this of Mr. Clampett, but I got my hand raised too late for that. So, Bob, I'm afraid you're the victim of this one. My question is about continued innovation of the gear and how maybe we should be thinking about handling that from a regulatory standpoint. Couple of the points you raised were essentially, we had to put some regs in place just to get the gear going, and as we gain experience, some of those regs have to be modified as we learn more about what's sort of an effective pot. And the council doesn't do innovation very well in terms of regulations. We're a very slow process that doesn't fit innovation well. I'm wondering what your thoughts might be about how to structure specifications for these pots that allow continued innovation without having to come back and amend a fishery management plan each time, or in essence, go through that kind of an effort. Do you have some thoughts on how to do that, or is this actually working for you and for the fleet?
Through the chair, Mr. Twite, the biggest restriction right now that I think on innovation is that 9-inch opening. I don't know if the 9-inch opening is the most efficient. It seems to be pretty good for catching black cod. However, if in the Gulf you want to put the strings up a little shallower, we're fishing, the guys are fishing between 250 to as deep as 600, maybe 700 fathoms with the pots. And if they were to string the pots up shallower, they could possibly get some of their halibut catch as well. And so there needs to be some flexibility on designing that entryway. The current entryway probably isn't very efficient for catching a flatfish, 32-inch in length. So that would be the biggest concern I have is going forward and having some restriction on the opening of the pot, whether it's a traditional pot or a slinky pot.
Thanks, Bob.
Mr. Mesereau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your testimony. My question for you is regarding the elimination of marking the second end of a string of pots. Just from my own experience fishing with fixed gear, it seems like marking both ends of a string just prevents you from losing more gear. So I guess I'm wondering if it's worth, for convenience, not marking one end, if the other side of the argument is it would be more difficult to recover your gear if you part off. I guess if you could just speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, through the chair, there's a difference of opinion with some of the guys, but the majority of FVOA believes there should be a marker on either end. And the concern at the one end is the buoy line for pots is usually a pretty thick piece of material, and it takes up a lot of room once you have all your gear stored on a boat. So some of our guys are using regular long line ground line for their second to end, and so they don't have to carry as big a gear for that end. So the majority of FVOA believes there ought to be a marker on either end. That's not a universal opinion, but that's, since you specifically asked about that, that's how our board has come down.
Thank you.
Further questions for Mr. Albertson? Thank you for your testimony.
Yep, thank you.
Next up is Alexander Stubbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Alexander Stubbs, a commercial fisherman in California and Alaska, and also a research biologist at UC Berkeley. I'm also the originator of slinky pot fishing, a gear type that's increasingly being used in Alaska, especially by smaller vessels that are not easily able to fish traditional bot gear. The introduction of this new gear in 2020 is in large part why you see a spike in pot fishing last year. In the presentation, you saw that 70 new vessels began using pots in 2020. I've sold slinky pots to well over 150 vessels since February of 2020 when slinky pots were introduced by me. By my calculation, this means slinky pots could be well over half the pot fleet for Sablefish. We need urgent action on rules for this new gear type. This gear type has greatly improved profitability of many operations in Alaska and has undoubtedly reduced bycatch and whale depredation. I'd like to bring the Council's attention to the need for updated regulations, as the current regulations are applicable to the larger traditional pod designs, but not easily applicable to these slinky pots people are using. In particular, the regulations regarding the biodegradable panel to prevent ghost fishing should be addressed by the Council. As currently written, this regulation states that, quote, each pot must be equipped with a biodegradable panel of at least 18 inches in length that is parallel to and within 6 inches of the bottom of the pot and that is sewn up with untreated cotton thread of no larger than size 30, end quote. In designing slinky pots for the Alaskan fishery and the fishery in Canada, Washington, Oregon, and California, I include 2 doors on all traps with the idea that one door can be sewn shut with cotton, making a biodegradable panel. Tying the second door shut with cotton is the most effective method to prevent ghost fishing. If a door is not tied shut, the fish can easily escape. Using the door as the escape mechanism has been accepted in Oregon, Washington, California, Canada, and in the French toothfish fishery currently using my gear. The solution was accepted by National Marine Fisheries Enforcement, OLE, in Kodiak and elsewhere for the 2020 season, but this year, less than a week before the start of the season, OLE apparently decided to overrule this based on there not being a clear bottom to the pot and that apparently NIMS does not consider a door to be a panel. I'll note that Merriam-Webster's dictionary of panel includes the word door, as do many others, and I haven't been able to find a definition of the word panel that would not include a door, but given that they have decided that doors aren't panels, there's a clear need for updated regulations or clarification from the Council. NIMS still has not stated what their definition of panel they're using is, and they haven't provided clarity to the fishing community on how to be in compliance with their new interpretation of the existing regulations, leading local law enforcement officers to tell fishermen different and often conflicting information on how to remain in compliance. Apparently, some people are being told to put weights on one side of the pod to define a door. Other people are being told to slit the net open. One major advantage of slinky pots is their lightweight and the fact they're not likely to injure crew in rough weather. Obviously, attaching weights to them negates this. And from a conservation standpoint, weighting pots will increase the impact on the bottom and be more likely to snag. I have additional comments in my public testimony, which you're welcome to read.
right, thank you for your testimony, Mr. Stubbs. Ms. Campbell has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Stubbs, one of the things that I want to avoid doing here is launching a regulatory amendment that allows the current configuration to be legal but stifles further innovation, because this is a new, rapidly developing fishery. And so if you have any thoughts on, as one of the people who has developed some of the innovative gear that's being used, if you have any thoughts for the council on how we might best thread that needle, I would appreciate hearing them.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And in my prepared comments to you, I note that I don't think that slinky pots are necessarily the ultimate solution for this gear. I think the issue is that the current regulations state that there has to be a panel. So I think clarification from the council as to what the definition of panel is might be helpful to OLE. And secondly, the fact that it needs to be parallel to and within a certain number of inches of the bottom, I think is also an issue. I would suggest that wording that's a little bit more loose might encourage more innovation, which is that there needs to be a opening of at least 18 inches, which when exposed to seawater rots and allows fish escapement. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I don't really know exactly how to do this in the best possible way. But I think that just having to have a defined bottom is one barrier to being able to do different types of collapsible pots, which I've also experimented with other types that wouldn't work for this. And then also, apparently OLE has a problem with the definition of panel. So I think it would be nice to be able to eliminate the word panel so that there is an 18-inch escapement mechanism, or perhaps the council could provide clarification on what they see the definition of panel as meaning, because from my standpoint, I think OLE was maybe a little bit loose with coming up with their own definition, which they still haven't provided to the fishing community. And I guess the other thing I'll just add really quickly is that I think that we should also, the other part of this is the 9-inch tunnel requirement. Okay, I have customers in Canada, Russia, and the Bering Sea successfully targeting halibut and pots. The Russians off Kamchatka just ordered 500 of them for their factory longliners to charge us turbot and halibut. And I think that allowing us to be able to experiment with different designs and multiple gear types to target halibut, and I think later you'll hear about longline turbot pots, would also be very helpful and would allow us to be able to test additional gear types without having to go all the way to the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands or Kamchatka, which is what I'm having to do right now.
Thank you, Mr. Stubbs. Thank you, Mr. Chair. No more questions.
You're muted.
Mr. Franklin, Dave Franklin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, yes, we can. Good afternoon.
Hi, I'm Dave Franklin. I've got the fishing vessel Hotspur, and I fish black cod and halibut in the Gulf of Alaska. And, excuse me. About 20 years ago, we were fishing out of Sitka longline, and we were doing good. I was so smart and happy. We were getting 3,000 pounds of string. String's about a quarter mile to a half mile long for a few days. And then the whales showed up, and it dropped down to about 300 pounds of string. So they took about 90%. And it was terrible. And we had to go back to town and spend another 4 or 5 days baiting up and then going back out. Well, a lot of work. A few years later, we bought an auto baiter so we could really power through the whales. Then I was smart again, so that worked for about 3 or 4 or 5 years. And then there was more and more whales, and we couldn't power through them. Then I used to be able to catch my quota in 7 trips. And then I got to 10, 12, 14 trips, and now we can't even catch it all. So we're switching over to pots now, and there's just no way you can get fish back with longline with the amount of whales out there. And whatever you do to make it easier for the pot guys, it's going to be better for the resource. When they came on me, the whales were taking 90%, I figured, with the catch I had. So for every fish that a pot guy delivers, that's just one fish that's coming out of the resource. But for every fish a longline's delivering, that's I don't know, it's at least 2 fish, I guess, one for the boat and one for the whales, and maybe even more. And I feel bad for the small guys that their boats aren't quite as big to pot fish, but the slinky pots really help them out. They can do that. There's smaller boats fishing Dungeness crab off Washington in the wintertime, and they seem to do it okay in bad weather. They'll have, when the season starts, sometimes they pay a bigger boat to drop all their pots, and then they don't have to have a lot of deck space. They just run their gear, and at the end of the season, they just bring a few pots in at a time. So they're able to make it work okay, and they aren't, and they're stackable. So the slinky pots break down so you can bring a lot in. You don't have to worry about that. So for the guys that can't fish that, I think they're mistaken. I think just about any boat can fish the slinky pots. And right now is a good time for the guys that don't think they can afford it. The SBA has 3% COVID loans for 30-year payoff. So getting a 3% loan for 30 years is a good thing. It's a great thing. And guys that say they can't afford to do that, I think they'd really be helping the resource and helping themselves if they switched over. I still have friends that have their auto baiter.
Mr. Franklin?
The whole philosophy is...
Mr. Franklin, your time is up. Can you provide a concluding?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Okay,
Do you have okay. All right. Let's see if there's any questions. Don't see any. Thanks so much for your testimony. All right. Next up is Nick Johansson.
Yeah, hello, thank you. My name is Nick Johansson. I have the fishing vessel St. Dominic, and I pot fish for the first time last fall out of Southeast. Thank you for giving me the chance to testify. Anyways, my big issue is having to stack out every time we go in to deliver. It's been a real burden to my crew and myself to have to stack out in any kind of conditions to sell, to go in and sell our fish in any kind of weather. So we'd like to see that change so we can leave the gear out. I propose that we let the gear stay out for up to 10 days. You know, if the season gets longer, severe weather is going to last longer. We're not going to leave the gear out casually and forget about it. We want to fish our gear. If we're fishing, we're fishing. We want to fish our gear and we want to get out there. But if there's severe weather, sometimes severe weather can last 5 days, 6 days. Well, why should a guy have to call up nymphs and enforcement and say, hey, you know, I'm weather bound here? Or say you're weather bound for a while. You guys have allowed us to leave gear out. You're weather bound for a while. Weather breaks, you head out, you got a mechanical failure, you got to turn back around. So these are things to kind of free it up. Let the market kind of decide, you know, how we want to tend our gear. It's very expensive gear, and AIS would solve a lot of the gear conflict. And what I did when I went out there to go pot fishing was the same thing I did when I was longlining. Is I would look around, I'd look on my AIS, I'd look around for gear. I would communicate with my fellow fishermen out there and say, okay, I'd like to be from here to here. Where are you? Where do you want to go? It's the same thing I've done for 25 years out there. So this preempting the grounds is, I'm not buying it one bit. And the other thing is, the sooner we get it caught, the sooner the grounds open up, the less I got to spend in fuel. And some of the most dangerous times for my crew are when we're stacking out. If we got to stack out every trip, we should stack out once. We should stack out when we're done with the season. We go out, we set the gear, and we fish the gear. We go in and out of town, we sell the fish. So the other thing I would like to see is the 9-inch tunnel requirements, lose that. Let necessity, the mother of invention, let us determine how to rig our pots. I'm all for the biodegradable escape gear, the cotton, but let these smart people, the Slinky Pot's an example. There's other guys that can develop pots that can catch halibut, catch sablefish safely, effectively, and we don't have to overregulate this fishery. I'm all for losing the tags. I don't think the tags served any kind of a purpose. And so, yeah, everybody benefits. More fish, like Dave was saying, everybody benefits. More fish caught by pots leaves more fish on the grounds for other fishers. So I think we should.
Your
yes.
time is. Can you provide a concluding comment?
Yes, I think it would be better to try. It'd be great for the council to let the pot boats, let us determine how to rig our pots. Let us leave our gear out there to fish. We're constrained by our quota, and yeah, it's way better for the resource. So I'll thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your testimony. Really appreciate it. Ms. Kimball has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony. I was tracking your issues, and I believe they would all be covered under the advisory panel's motion, but I wanted to confirm whether you support all the changes that the advisory panel suggested.
Hi, thank you for that. The advisory panel, I was in favor of so just about all of it, I guess. Yeah, that was the pots, configuring the tunnel different. You're going to have to go over it. I was driving down the freeway, to be honest, so I got myself a little worked up here. So you're going to have to go over the what was on there. But I was all in favor of what Paul said, Bob, Dave, the gentleman who builds the Slinky Pots. They all make sense.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Mr. Johansson? Thank you for your testimony.
Thanks.
All right, next up is Lynn Benkin, and then last up will be Megan O'Neill.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the council. Linda Benkin testifying for Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association. I wanted to start by saying that our membership now includes the full range of people participating in the sablefish fishery as far as use of gear. So we have boats that have switched to pots, some using big pots. We have boats that are trying out Slinky Pots. We have boats that are hook and line and Slinky Pots, and boats, most of our membership still that's smaller boats using exclusively hook and line. So the full range, we've had lots of conversations about all the issues in front of you. We've hosted a number of workshops to help people understand what innovations are out there for pot gear. Really what our goal is try to minimize gear conflicts on the ground while maintaining the economic viability and the operational success of both gear types. And that's really what's informed our recommendations. I just want to briefly remind you of why the pot limits were set lower in the first place in Southeast, and maybe draw your attention to our written comments where we pointed out the Sablefish Stock Assessment does identify that the shelf slope in Southeast, well, one, it's closer to the beach, 12 to 20 miles versus over 90 when you get past Yakutat. It's also much more narrow, limited to just over 10,000 square kilometers of bottom area, and that contour between 100 fathoms and 500 fathoms. which is about 60% less than the extent of the shelf slope area when you get out to the Central Gulf. And in Southeast, we have 328 permits fished on 169 vessels. If you look at the Central Gulf, there's 302 permits on only 133 vessels. So again, the grounds are more limited. There's more boats close to the beach, which has made it more workable for smaller boats to participate in this fishery. So the smaller pot limit was to make sure we were minimizing the gear conflicts between the two gear types. Certainly a hook and line boat using lighter gear, having lighter hydraulics will break off when tangled with the heavier pots. So certainly puts that gear type at more risk, and more important for hook and line boats to know where pots are and be able to avoid them when they're out fishing on the grounds. So we do want to see you retain in the options that pot limit, as well as the requirement for the gear to be removed from the grounds when a boat goes in to unload. At this point, the AP has retained those options in its recommendations to you, and we certainly support keeping those in as you move this ahead. We do feel it's important to have both ends of sets marked. We really look forward to AIS being legal on fishing gear and hope you keep that in the mix as we continue to work in that direction. We recognize that the current marking requirements with 4 buoys and radar reflectors are onerous. We're fine with getting rid of those requirements. We support getting rid of those requirements with a push towards using AIS as a much better solution. We certainly understand the issues with pots and doors and panels, and hope that the council can find a way out of that to allow innovation in design of pots in a way to allow the fleet to continue to evolve them to work better on a wider range of vessels. I think I touched on pot tag requirements. The one, we understand that it's costly, that it's been burdensome for the agency, understand why there's a recommendation from the AP to get rid of that pot tag requirement, but would just say that if you do elect to get rid of pot tags, it seems to make sense that you include in this analysis going forward some discussion of what would be used in place to enforce pot limits and to enforce the tending requirements or prevent sharing of pots, grounds preemption issues that were part of the motivation between the pot tags in the first place. So to wrap up, we largely support what the AP recommended to you. We would ask that you eliminate the sentence from the purpose and need that speaks to this, that some of the requirements in the existing regulations that were intended to help small boats are not helping small boats. We don't really agree with that statement, don't think it really has a place in the purpose and need. And we also ask that you include a discussion of what might replace the pot tag requirement to achieve the goals that was originally intended to address. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Benkin. Mr. Down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Benkin. So on the pot limit issue, I'm just trying to follow your logic, and I was on the council when we set the pot limits in place, so I understand the reasons that we did this, which were many of the same reasons that you just mentioned. But when you're talking about grounds preemption, whether somebody's using longline gear or pot gear, I think the same grounds preemption exists. You mentioned the hydraulic issues that some smaller boat with hook and line gear might have smaller hydraulics, be using smaller ground line, and therefore if you have a gear conflict, you're more likely to be able to part the gear and get out of that conflict. But one of the things we heard in public testimony was that even going from 120 to 170 on the pot limit, rather than go clear up to some bigger number, would be a great help to some of the fishermen that are fishing in Southeast. If we looked at this something in that range. Is it still as big an issue? Does that help if it was only to go to 170, or is it just that absolutely not? You have to stay with the 120 pot limit.
Hold on.
Mr. Down through the chair, I guess I would say that at this point, our position is our group supports largely the 120 pot limit, but more importantly, we want to see that option kept in the analysis as you look at where pot limits might be changed and where they might not be changed. We have heard some support out of fishermen in the West Yakutat area for an incremental increase in that area, more in the range you're talking about of 175 to 200 pots. But I think it's too early to be arriving at the perfect number at this point. What we're asking is that the options include the range as they do in the recommendations from the AP to keep in place the current pot limits, as well as to look at some incremental increases, particularly in the area to the west.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Benkin. That was exactly the clarification I was looking for. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Down. Further questions from Ms. Benkin? Okay, thank you for your testimony. All right.
Thank you.
Last up is Megan O'Neill.
Hello, members of the council. I'm Megan O'Neill, and I'm the director of Petersburg Vessel Owners Association. Thank you for the opportunity to testify tonight. PVOA was supportive of the implementation of sablefish pots, and we still want this to be a viable gear type for the sablefish fishery while minimizing gear conflicts. Our membership supports maintaining the current pot limits. We just saw a transition to pot gear has occurred quicker in the Western Gulf than the Eastern Gulf of Alaska, where only 16 to 33% of landed sablefish were caught in pot gear in 2020. Additionally, observer data shows that in Western Yak and Southeast, the average number of pots being fished is under 60, or under half of the 120 pot limit in the last 2 years. Due to slower adoption in these areas, we're cautious to ask for too many changes too quickly. As more vessels fish pot gear in the Eastern Gulf, we may find there isn't enough time and area to accommodate a higher pot limit. We are interested in analyzing increasing the gear tending time in Southeast to match the 5-day requirement in West Yak. We think this may be a compromise between the desire of some fishermen to increase the pot limit for efficiency. We also heard that pot tags are not used by OLI or the Coast Guard for pot limit enforcement and has been increasingly expensive for RAM. For these reasons, members support removing this requirement, but wish to maintain data tracking of pot use and a mechanism to enforce pot limits. We hope this can be done through logbooks. I've heard people ask for increased pot limits in case they lose pots. If the pot tag requirement was removed, there may be no need to increase the pot limit as vessels could carry these extra pots on board. PVOA also supports loosening pot configuration requirements to enable innovation. Slinky pots have soft tunnels, and in Southeast, OLI officers have been struggling to determine if these tunnels meet or exceed the 9-inch tunnel opening limit. We ask that this regulation be clarified. We also support adjusting the release mechanism regulation to allow the door of slinky pots to be tied shut with cotton twine in place of a panel. This would function the same way as the cotton release used on dungy pots and likely create a more accessible exit for fish if a pot is lost. On slinky pots, fishermen are currently cutting the web to make a 18-inch panel within 6 inches of the bottom of the pot. This results in the weight of all the fish laying on top of this release panel as the pot is lifted from the water and aboard the vessel. The web of these pots is light, and we think a door option may be more functional. We also support the removal of the requirement for 4 hard balls and a radar reflector on each end of a pot set. Due to wind and tide currents, in some areas this is enough drag to pull ends under. Finally, we ask the requirement to mark each end remains. We feel this is important to prevent gear conflicts and the loss of gear. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. O'Neill. Are there any questions? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
that concludes public comment for the agenda item D1. Council interested in taking action? Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am interested in taking action on some of the items that we heard about today, but I'm also interested in consolidating them with some other actions that we won't hear about until we get the balance of the IFQ committee report. And I wonder if it would be appropriate to delay action on D1 until after we've had our report and our public comment on D4.
Ms. Campbell, I think that that approach makes sense to me. And if the rest of the council is comfortable with that, we can go ahead and plan on delaying as you suggest. I'm not seeing any heads shaking, so let's go ahead and plan for that. Thank you, Ms. Campbell. So with that, let's go ahead and break for the day. We'll come back at 8 o'clock tomorrow and resume with our agenda. See you tomorrow morning.
Good night.
Thanks.
The meeting is now over. All the participants have been disconnected.